thinking back to those days that we were working on a film called Nocturna Artificialia, the first film I worked with the Quay Brothers. And I should just talk a little bit about how we got put together, because that was 35 years ago. It was a very, 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 very different time, both in terms of the whole world, but in terms of filmmaking, technology, the way people thought about filmmaking, the way people thought about animation, the way people funded films, and so on. It was very different, and it's almost hard to explain what we went through at that time. I had been working off and on in the UK. I'm from Chicago, and I had come over to work on some films that were being made at the British Film Institute in London, and they had a production board that funded non-commercial films, experimental films, animation, documentaries, different kinds of narrative filmmaking. And this is where the Quay Brothers came in. There was a man there named Keith Griffiths, who was the producer of the Quay, the producer of the Quay Brothers. Keith said, "Come on over, we'll find something for you to do." Isn't that amazing? Somebody would say that. And I came over, and it was the middle of a very brutal winter in London, and he said, "There are these two guys, they're from the States too, you'll get to like them. They've made an animated film and they need a soundtrack. Would you like to do a soundtrack?" I said, "Sure." And he put us together in this little room, pathetic little cutting room out in West London near the BBC. The BBC had a lot of freelance people working at that time for them, and there were editing rooms in houses. They would buy these houses up and turn them into editing rooms. It was very cold. We worked for 2 weeks on this film with our coats on the whole time. And the interesting thing was, none of us, neither the two Quay brothers nor myself, knew exactly what we were going to do. They had a film, it had music on it. It was a beautiful animated film about a tram and a man in a tram. And we sat down and looked at it, and then we looked at each other and said, "What do we do now?" I said, "I don't know, get some tram sounds." So we went to our friend at the BBC who gave us little discs of tram sounds, and we started bit by bit to put together a soundtrack without any real knowledge of what we were doing. And I think that moment, which we tended to repeat on every film, trying to start from zero, trying to start over every time. The most important rule is have a beginner's mind whenever you're working. Always start over, start from scratch. Don't have preconceptions, don't have expectations, start afresh. And I think that's the rule that we followed unknowingly, but we always had a beginner's mind. And I certainly always, when I worked with the Quay Brothers, I always start new on every film. what we started doing was putting sounds on pictures. If something moved, we put a sound on it. Later on, you see the character that was introduced there, and there are squeaks to his body, and scrapes when he walks and moves. And I think right after that film, we all kind of decided that that was not the way to go about this. Puppets are unnerving. They're unsettling. They can make you anxious because there's this thing there that seems to have life but doesn't quite have life. And they said that adding a voice or an effect neutralizes this. In a sense, it lets the audience off the hook. We can look at this and it becomes more comfortable because it has a noise or a sound or a voice that we can relate to. And it takes away the otherness of the puppet, and that's what they wanted to avoid. They wanted to steep us into the otherness of the puppet, to have to make us confront this thing that's kind of half alive, half not alive. So through a series of films that they made after this, a couple for TV, a couple what you might call documentaries, we kind of tested doing away with this, taking the sounds away. They also talked about Radio Moscow a lot, because if you went into their studio, they'd usually be playing shortwave radio, very, very quietly in the background. Just this hiss of strange voices and static. And that became a key component of some of their soundtracks, because it had this sense of somebody over there that you can't quite hear and you can't quite understand, with this layer of static between you and him or her, usually a him. And they said that they made a lot of recordings of Radio Moscow during this time. And they said that these recordings could create a spell. They could almost put a spell on you because they are hypnotizing. And so this too became an element of the soundtracks. The third element that we developed over a period of time, and this was partly because I never understood what their films were about, we would start working on a film, and rather than go through a rather torturous process of them trying to explain what it was about, which they would not do, and me keep asking questions, I found that if I went to their studio and started recording their studio at the time that they were making the film, recording props, recording the bits of wood and material that they were using, this acted as a way into their world and into the sound world of their film. So it became a routine that I would go to their studio around the time we started the soundtrack, and I would just say, what have you been using? And we would start recording it. And then they would pull other things down and say, this makes a noise, and if you do this, it makes this noise, and if you turn this wheel, it makes another noise. And we would record all of these, and this would be the beginning of the soundtrack. A lot of that never appeared in films. A lot of it appeared almost in every film. Sounds that they just picked and said, that's part of our palette. Working with twins is very particular. I can have a certain kind of a conversation with them, but there are boundaries. There are boundaries to what they want to reveal to me. Things that go on between themselves, ideas, ways of thinking, inspirations. So I'm sort of on the outside of this guessing, and my guessing is done through the soundtrack. I put things in, say, what's that like? And you get one answer from one and one answer from the other. And then you move it around a bit and you try to compromise between the two. At some point they just say, well, we'll talk about it at home tonight and come back tomorrow and let you know. One last thing before we show the next clip is the role of music, which is paramount. In many ways, the films are based around music, not sound. The sound comes later. The music comes, in most cases, before the films are even started to be made. they had developed a relationship with a composer in Warsaw, Leszek Jankowski, who would not see the films. He would compose music to the Quay's ideas. So he was inspired by the Quays. And they would exchange a lot of material over a period of time. The script, ideas for the script, inspiration for the script, photographs, paintings, writings, photographs, postcards, all kinds of material would go back and forth. And at some point, after some discussion, Leszek would come up with the music and hand it over to the Quays and say, this is my contribution to your film. And then from that point on, almost like Radio Moscow, this music would be played in the studio. It would form the basis for this world that they began to work in over a long period of time. I mean, you're talking 6 months, a year of building sets and filming. But there would always be music going on in the background, very lightly. So they weren't animating to the music, but they were being inspired by, moved by. They were getting into the music in a very, very, very profound way and finding what in the music they wanted to talk about, they wanted to animate to, they wanted to bring out in the film. So by the time I get the soundtrack, they would say, here's the film, there's the music, there's no music there, you can do sound there. There's no music there, you can do sound there. There's music there, and that doesn't get any sound, don't go near that. There is music there, but maybe you can do something with the sound. So it's kind of open, but not exactly completely open. Music for this film, Institut of Crocodiles, from the composer on reel-to-reel tape. And you couldn't quite tell if it was stereo, is it mono, what is it? How did he record it? I don't know, but what speed should it go at? Well, it's kind of this speed, it's kind of that speed. The sound too, when we were recording, now I teach at a film school outside London, everybody has the highest quality equipment to work with and the best facilities. Everybody has a soundproof room to record in. Everybody, not everybody in the world, but anybody working on a film has this available to them in Western Europe. And we didn't have that. If we wanted to record sound, we did it in our houses, in their studio, which were far from soundproof. And very often we would have to put a blanket over ourselves to record the sound effects and keep out background noise. Consequently, this has an effect on the aesthetic of the soundtrack. Things tended to be recorded very closely. It was all we could do. If we tried to get any space on it, we'd hit the blanket, or you'd get sound from outside. And so all of the sounds have a close, they feel close. They feel very, there's not a lot of air around them. And this creates a certain kind of dynamic where the objects seem quite real, quite tactile. But it's all because everything wasn't perfect. We just didn't have the wherewithal or the facilities or the money to do that kind of work perfectly. And it was interesting because once we did have a studio to record in, and I had an assistant, and it was a wonderful day, and didn't know what to do. We just kind of didn't know how to do it because we had too much equipment to work with. And I remember Keith, the producer, coming over and saying, if I locked you in a toilet, you'd know how to do this, but I give you a professional recording studio and you get lost. And that was kind of the attitude we had. We could work very rough and ready, and we actually used the what's the word for it? The qualities of the sound, the imperfect qualities, are some of the things that we're editing with. The little clicks and the bumps and the sounds that you would normally cut out are the things that we're using. So it's all part of the aesthetic of these soundtracks. The next thing I want to show is Institut Benjamenta, which was their first live-action film, feature-length, which included animation and live-action. It was a very different animal to work with because it was a feature film. It was going to be shown to supposedly larger audiences. It did have this feeling, this aspect of narrative to it. So everybody thought, all right, we have to act like adults now and start making a serious film. Originally, the idea was that the whole film would be post-produced. The soundtrack would be post-produced. It would be added later. Voices would be added, effects would be added. Because of the constraints of the budget, it was decided that couldn't be done. It all had to be recorded on location, in sync. We were using live sound from the actors and the sets. The set was an old house near Hampton Court outside London. Very large rooms, very high ceilings, quite echoey, and actors speaking very quietly, because one of the Quay's directions always is mezzo, mezzo, keep it down, quiet, quiet, quiet. So you're getting to the point where people are almost whispering. When the footage comes back, we have what you will see if you haven't seen it already, stunning visuals, stunning, very idiosyncratic visuals, which were made in many ways a lot like their puppet films, but with live actors and full-size sets. But the sound was like a documentary. It was people in a room, a big room. And it didn't quite work. It felt off. But we were told, no, sorry, no money. We're going to have to make do with that. Okay. But there were a few scenes that we knew we had to replace the sound on because of airplanes in the background, other reasons. So we did what you normally do when you post-produce. You go in and you do what are called Foley Effects, which are things like footsteps, people's movements, the sounds of their clothes moving, small props, and things like that. You do it in a studio watching the film. There's a Foley artist who performs this. So if people are walking, the Foley artist does footsteps on the proper surface in sync with the picture. It's very common practice. And we start doing this, and the Quays love this because it's completely fake. And they're looking at a man who's doing the sound of, I think you'll see a monkey in the film. and he had a little bit of like fake grass and his fingers, and he's just doing that and ringing the bell. And it's amazing. And then we started doing the voices. We were doing a couple of voices. Again, the actors come into the studio, they look at themselves, they listen to their original track, and they re-voice their voices. Again, common practice. Quays had never done this. And this was like ecstasy. The psychological state, not the drug. And they said, this is fantastic, because the voice is a little bit off from the image. It creates a slight sense of a dream. And for them, this was the ideal thing. Moving the sound away from its source again. Making the audience think about, what is this object I'm looking at? Why doesn't the sound go with it exactly? How does that engage the audience? And so they said, we want to do this to the whole film, which is quite an expensive proposition to take on. But, and I think this is where I have to give a lot of credit to their producer for what you're seeing in these films, Keith Griffiths. He understood the process that they go through. He understands that all the money should not be spent through the shooting, but that post-production is a very, very creative part of their work. Things are going to happen in post-production after the shooting stops. And he kept a little money aside, knowing that that's how they work. That's how they've always worked. They always keep going, keep going, keep going, keep inventing until the very end of the production. And he was able to go back, and rather than just say, no, I'm sorry, the budget doesn't allow this, get on with your work, he said, no, we'll do it. And we ended up post-syncing most of the film. The other aspect of this is that it was done in mono Dolby, which is not that common, but it's done. The idea being that, again, we didn't want to give this space. We didn't want to give it the kind of life and breadth that Dolby Surround could give. So we decided to keep it in mono. I'm a very big fan of mono, because I think it gives the impression more of sound going into the picture rather than coming around and surrounding the audience. I've always thought that was very important for these films, that you get pulled into the picture rather than enveloped in a soundtrack. So we used Dolby, and what it did give us was a clarity and a dynamic range of sound that we wouldn't have had otherwise. That's why we used Dolby at the time. But we didn't want to use it for its spatial qualities, for the surround sound qualities. We wanted to keep it all as much in the center as possible.
I wish to enroll.
To enroll? Certainly.
This way, if you please.
Keine Bewegung, bitte.
The Quays know about sound. They think about sound. They take copious notes about what should go in the soundtrack. And for the next film we're going to look at, I tried to find a copy of it, but I haven't been able to. They gave me a musical staff where they had mapped out the soundtrack in layers according to the lines of the musical staff. So they were thinking about this as music. They were thinking about how to orchestrate the sound effects with the music and the picture. So the thinking about the sound comes from the inside too. It's not always just being laid on top. And that creates a very particular kind of film. And in that sequence, like the whole beginning had sound through it. We put all the water down, we put all the movements, we put the outside atmospheres, and little by little it all came out. In a way that I would describe it, the way the sound designer Walter Murch talks about this. And he said, you know, we have to create gaps. We have to create gaps in filmmaking to allow in the audience's imagination. If we just keep giving you all the information, we give you every movement, every sound, every effect, there's no room for you. So the idea is to create a lot of room for you. And I think that makes some audiences uncomfortable. Some of my students look at these films and go, why would you make a film like that? It's a generational thing too. So it is a particular kind of film that asks for a certain kind of audience engagement. One thing I want to talk about on this film, which is kind of an example of everything I've been talking about, and it actually was made 10 years before Institut Benjamenta, is the mixer, another important part of this team. A man named Colin Martin, who in London was a very, very good and talented, skillful, and well-known mixer for documentaries. He did mostly TV documentaries, and I had worked with him a few times, and when it came time to doing the Quays film, they said, who do you want to mix with? And I thought, it would be very difficult to work with somebody who I didn't know. Even though Colin, I wouldn't have thought offhand, had the outlook and the interest in films like the Quays, but we had a personal relationship, which I thought would be very important to be able for the Quays to talk to him, relate to him, and have an openness in the mixing theater. But I think what's interesting, and he did do Institut, did he do Benjamenta? He did Benjamenta, and he did Street of Crocodiles, I think he did The Comb, is that coming with a documentary aesthetic was really important in the end. It's not something we thought about, but I think in retrospect, having somebody who's very interested in hearing the reality of a sound worked in very well with the twins' attitudes towards wanting to understand the essence of objects. They didn't want a lot of mixing. They wanted to hear sounds, and they wanted to hear music, and they wanted to look at pictures. And to have a documentary mixer who didn't overwork the sound, I think was very important for these films. I'd like to say one other thing, that those of you who have seen the exhibition know the wealth of material that has influenced the Quays, and certainly the images, if not the sound too. We were doing a question and answer session at a retrospective they had in Boston a few years ago, and somebody in the audience asked, how can I make films like you? And probably hoping the answer would be a certain plug-in or software or buy clothes like this, cut your hair a certain. They said, we spend a lot of time in libraries, and that shut everybody up. And I think that's a really good point, that this isn't all of the things, and your questions have been very good about the soundtrack and music. This isn't about just sound and just music or technology. putting sound together with picture. It really is about all of this wealth of influences that you can come up with. And spending a lot of time in archives and libraries is the key to that.